Okay, we're very grateful to today's speaker, not only for coming to speak to us at this seminar, but actually coming for 3 days to Cambridge. And Professor Iliffe will be engaging with the audiences for the play Let Newton Be this evening, tomorrow night, and indeed on Thursday. So we're especially grateful to him for that, and also for acting as an advisor and a consultant for Craig Baxter, the playwright of this new play, over these past months in helping him with these wonderful materials that are available online in the Newton Project, of which Rob Iliffe is indeed the editorial director. So Professor Iliffe, as you know, is from the University of Sussex. He's Professor of Intellectual History and the History of Science there in the Department of History. And he's also the author of a number of books, but the one I want to mention particularly is the very short introduction to Newton, published by OUP 2007. We have it on our bookstall, discounted, and I'm sure you'll be happy to sign it afterwards, so do have a look at that and pick up your copy. So, as I mentioned, Professor Iliffe also developed this wonderful Newton Project, the online publication of all the materials written by Newton and his contemporaries, which really, many of them never seen the light of day up until this moment. And so that's a great project and a huge resource for those, of course, working in this area. So we're delighted he can come to speak to us today, and his talk is entitled Newton, Science and Religion. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. Newton, Science and Religion is a very big topic, but I do want to try and capture some of the intricacies of what Newton was doing in his theological writings. And I also want to try and look at the way that people have tried to understand Newton's religious beliefs, and also the relationship between his scientific and religious beliefs over the last 300 years, which is rather a lot. So we start off, I suppose, with some basic facts about Newton, which is that he lived from, if you're in England anyway, he was born in 1642 on Christmas Day. If you're on the continent, he was born on January the 4th, 1643. And in this country, he died on the 20th of March, 1727. So he was 84 when he died. We know that as a relatively young man, one of us smiles at that, in his mid-30s, he became a radical heretic. There's almost no doubt about that at all. He came to have grave doubts, to put it mildly, about the Orthodox doctrine of the Holy Trinity, and in a sense, it's an extension of his deep anti-Catholicism, which is what he shares with many of his radical Protestant contemporaries in England. He also spends most of his life interpreting Revelation and trying to understand history through prophecy. Obviously, for anyone in this period, he's somebody who believes that the world is going to exist for roughly 6,000 years. Probably 5,500 of those years have gone, so there isn't very much time left. That's what most people believe. So he thinks, like other radical Protestants, he's living in the last times. Of course, a belief endorsed by Daniel 12:4, many shall travel to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. When Newton died in 1727, there were several public texts that were available to everybody, as it were, which showed that Newton was a devout man, whatever his private views. And one or two people guessed that Newton was a heretic, an anti-Trinitarian, someone who thought Jesus was not God. The vast majority of people didn't know this, and they did not want to believe this, even if they had their suspicions. What people knew was that in the General Scholium, the edition Newton appended to the second edition of his Principia in 1713, Newton had made some remarkable comments about the nature of God. God was inhuman, is what he says in the 1729 translation. he's utterly unlike us. We anthropomorphise him at our peril. But there are nevertheless one or two interesting ways, and I'll talk about these, in which one can gain some kind of understanding of what God is like, how he created the world, and what his relationship with the creation is. Other people had also heard from Newton directly about his views about natural religion. That's the view, again, that everybody takes for granted, that the order and beauty in the world bespeaks not just the existence of God, but a particular kind of God. And it's also obvious that Newton's enunciation of the laws of motion and universal gravitation in the Principia also are evidence for a God who is a geometer. So everything that Newton does, both for him and the vast majority of his contemporaries, in terms of outlining and discovering new truths about nature, only goes further for him and others to show that God exists, and also they tell you a lot about God. To Richard Bentley in 1692 and 1693, Newton wrote a famous series of letters that were published in the 1750s, saying that, and those of you who work on modern issues to do with science and religion can see that these are harbingers of modern issues to do with the anthropic cosmological principle and so on and so forth. But Newton suggests, like many people, that this Earth is in a sense made for us. If it had been 2 degrees cooler, we wouldn't have existed. The planets all travel in roughly the same plane and in the same direction. They have been put in their places by God. And this is something, again, that Newton takes very seriously. After Newton died, his acolytes, particularly John Conduit, who married Newton's half-niece, and tried to write a biography of Newton, and then more famously the Lincolnshire antiquarian William Stukeley, they wrote biographies of Newton which attempted to save Newton's orthodox Anglicanism. Conduit, who knew Newton very well, was well aware in his drafts, which are, I will plug, no more than 5 times the Newton project. In the drafts, which are all available online, you can see him rewriting various bits and pieces where he's worried about Newton's unorthodox. I wouldn't say he knows that Newton's heterodox. He knows that Newton is an unorthodox and original thinker. Conduit, nevertheless, wants to save Newton as an Anglican because Newton has to worship regularly, publicly, in the Anglican Church. And again, if there's time at some point, I would like to suggest, or that there is evidence, there's substantial evidence, that Newton thought that you ought to be able to be a convinced anti-Trinitarian in a very, very broad swallow Anglican Church. Certainly, he argued this in the last 2 decades of his life. Other people knew that he was a heretic. John Locke was well aware that Newton was a heretic. Newton wrote a well-known paper on corruptions of Scripture to Locke in November 1690. That was published in Amsterdam in 1754. And the paper is on 2 notable corruptions of Scripture, but they are 1 John 5:7-8 and 1 Timothy 3:16. And he follows up that letter with about 20 other texts, all of them Trinitarian proof texts, which Newton tells Locke are in fact later accretions or additions added in by people who lived roughly at the time of Jerome and Augustine. Most famously, of course, I suppose, William Whiston, who was Newton's successor as Lucasian professor of mathematics, is somebody who breated outwardly, he shrieked from the marketplace, Newton's own views. And Whiston believed that it was his duty as a Christian to try and convince his contemporaries that the end of the world was nigh. And Whiston is somebody who would lecture, once he'd been kicked out of Cambridge in 1710, he went down to London and he would give lectures, because he had to earn a living, he would give lectures on natural philosophy, the contemporary word for science, that were then immediately followed by lectures on the apocalypse, where he told people that they should prepare for the end of the world. You don't get lectures like that anymore, but that's what you do get people down Oxford Street who make these claims. But that's what William Whiston did, Wicked Will Whiston, as he was called. When you get into the mid to late 18th century, there's a new view of Newton comes into being. One that is, I think, primarily, but not wholly, a French philosophe position, and that is that Newton has shown that human acumen is adequate to the truths of the outside world, that religion is a superstition of the past, and that we are now much more mature beings than was the case 100 years ago. Many people from Voltaire onwards, probably famously culminating in the biography written by Jean-Baptiste Biot in 1822, these people all had great difficulty with the fact of Newton's deep religiosity. And in a sense, at the same time as they constructed a story of Newton as the founder of a kind of anti-clerical Enlightenment. I mean, Newton is the founder of reason in the French Enlightenment. At the same time as they did this, they concocted a story which lasted really up until about the 1960s. They concocted a story that Newton did his extraordinary apocalyptic researches, which were published in 1733, and his extraordinary researches into chronology, which were published in 1728, some of which were anyway, only in his dotage, in his old age, in his senility, or he did it for fun when he was tired from doing mathematics and physics. This is a very it's a very interesting and plausible account of Newton's working life, which is that he effectively does mathematics. He's a Cambridge Don, but he has certain privileges because he's a great man, so the saying goes. It's known that he has special dispensation from the Secretary of State in February 1675 not to take holy orders, which as a fellow of Trinity College he's obliged to do. He's a special man. He's somebody, it's thought by the Enlightenment, who exhausted himself on mathematics and science, and then in this incredibly peculiar move in the 1690s, he first of all becomes an MP in 1689. He's one of the MPs that effectively elects William of Orange as William III. And then for 5 or 6 very troublesome years, during which he has his famous breakdown, he finally gets this bizarre position at the Mint, where he becomes Warden of the Mint. And there's an interesting book just come out called Newton and the Counterfeiter, which looks at Newton's final confrontation with the great counterfeiter William Chaloner, which ends in Chaloner's brutal death in March 1699. And again, there are some connections with the religion which we can talk about. If you go into the early 19th century, then people have problems with the idea, particularly in Britain. They again have problems with the idea that Newton is the founder of reason. And the biographer and defender of Newton, the Scottish optical scientist David Brewster, wrote a life of Newton in 1831, where he tried to recover Newton's sanity, where Biot had published evidence that Newton had a breakdown. Brewster published evidence that Newton had been completely compos mentis throughout. Where people had said that Newton did alchemy, Brewster said, well, maybe he did, but he never did it to make gold. And where people said he was an anti-Trinitarian, Brewster said, the evidence looks very much like he was, but I think I can, if you interpret it properly, you can see that he's not really an anti-Trinitarian. In the 1830s and 40s, a wealth of new evidence came out, really bolstering the more extreme view of Newton. And in 1855, Brewster wrote his great biography of Newton, The Life and Memoirs of Sir Isaac Newton, where he took on board for the first time the radical otherness of Newton. This person, in a sense, isn't like a 19th century scientist, the term, of course, being invented in 1833 to describe Faraday and John Herschel. Newton's not like that at all. He's a natural philosopher, he does alchemy, and he expends vast amounts of time on prophecy. Now, Brewster agrees with the anti-clericalists that Newton, although he's devout through his life, Newton probably did his researches in the last 30 to 40 years of his life. So the move to London to become Warden of the Mint in 1696 marks the halfway period of Newton's career, if you like. It's when his creative juices have gone. And for the last 4 decades of his life, by the middle of the 19th century, most people are agreed that the last 4 decades were somewhat sad, and he suddenly started looking at the apocalypse and chronology and so on and so forth. And that's basically the view for about 100 years. When the discipline of history and philosophy of science is founded in the post-Second World War period, Newton is at the heart of both the history of science and the philosophy of science. It's not an exaggeration to say that at least half the people in the nascent field of history of science worked on Newton. And they worked on the exact sciences. So they didn't work on Darwin. They didn't work on Lyell. You'll note that the gravitational field of everything has shifted in the last 30 or 40 years. But they worked on Newton's exact sciences and his mathematics. In that arena, some people took Newton's metaphysics seriously. So the great French historian of science, Alexandre Koyré, took Newton's metaphysics very seriously. But he doesn't like Newton's religion. He thinks that you can bracket that off as something that's irrelevant, a kind of excrescence, dotage, as Biot and others said. An even more powerfully positivist view of Newton's religion is to be found in the works of Bernard Cohen and Tom Whiteside. Both of these both of these great historians of science looked at Newton's physics and Newton's mathematics, and almost without exception, the chronological and historical and prophetic materials never enter their great works, their editions of Newton's text. They're not there. They're completely irrelevant. This is positivism in its purest form. In 1936, there had been a sale of Newton's non-scientific papers at Sotheby's, and all of his 5.5 million words of alchemy, his personal notebooks, his prophetic texts, all of this went for £9,000. And they were dispersed to about 40 different institutions around the world. Some of them, most of the alchemy was bought by John Maynard Keynes, and it ended up, on Keynes' death in 1946, it ended up in King's College, Cambridge. The vast millions of writings of prophetic text went missing. They were bought by a whole series of dealers, Quaritch, Schwartz, a whole series of other people, and we now know they ended up in the hands of the Semitic scholar Abraham Shalom Yehuda, who was an anti-Zionist, whose papers ironically ended up in the Jewish National and University Library in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1962. These papers were presumed lost, actually, for a good quarter of a century. And in the meantime, the 1950s and 60s, the only papers that people had to work on, really, with regard to Newton's alchemy and theology were in King's College, Cambridge. Keynes had bought a couple of prophetic and chronological works. And in the early 60s, the American historian Frank Manuel published a work called Isaac Newton, Historian, which showed that Newton was a committed Christian chronologist. So, Newton is like Scaliger. He's like all the people in the 16th century who tried to work out a kind of universal chronology of the history of the world by analysing Assyrian, Babylonian, Chinese, Danish, Irish, in some cases British sources, and trying to kind of make them all consistent within the general idea that roughly, as Usher says, we were brought into this world on the 23rd of October 4004 BC. That's what happens when you take patriarchal texts seriously. It's 4004 BC, give or take 20 or 30 years. And that's what Newton did. And it's a great work, Isaac Newton, Historian. It's one of the 4 or 5 best works on Newton, I think. And Manuel showed that that's what Newton was like. In the 60s, however, all the millions of writings, all the millions of words of Newton's prophetic texts were made. It was made known that they were in Jerusalem, and they were catalogued by 1969. And in the early 70s, Frank Manuel went to Jerusalem, and he wrote his Fremantle Lectures of 1973 on the basis of 3 months spent going through vast tranches of brittle and, as he thought, extraordinarily fascinating papers. In the aftermath of Manuel, people spent a small amount of time looking at these manuscripts. I mean, there are about 3.5, maybe 4 million words, and that takes an immense amount of time to read. And a new view of Newton came to being, a kind of counter-positivist view of Newton. And this one, I always say it's an inferiority complex that expresses itself as a superiority complex. By that I mean that here are people who want to convince readers that theology is important. And what they say is that theology is the fons et origo of Newton's value system, and that all of Newton's works are connected. They're intimately connected, and they sought to prove this in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. And that became a kind of dominant view. Even people like Bernard Cohen and others came to accept that, yes, Newton's alchemy was significant, and yes, bits and pieces of his religion were significant. And I want to, at the end, just conclude to say that I don't think that's true. I don't think that what I call a crude connectionist approach it doesn't get us anywhere. To say that Newton was a truth seeker in everything that he did, it doesn't help us. It doesn't tell us very much. Of course he's seeking truth. Anyway, so this is another plug for the Newton Project. It's randomly stuck in there. It's been going for 10 years. We're putting everything that Newton ever wrote online, and we're 2 years away from putting all of Newton's theological writings online. And the vast majority of which, so over 99% of all of Newton's writings, theological writings, have never been seen by anybody before, by more than, say, 4 or 5 people. And nearly all of these are available now. There's another 2 years to go. So, Newton's theology. Newton, as I said at the start, is particularly interested in... I hope you can read this, sorry. Newton's particularly interested in the complex relations between the study of the Bible and the study of the natural world. However, I call this natural theology. Right? So this is a place, natural theology is where we can say with some certainty, Newton thought that studying nature as a natural philosopher, studying nature had as its goal an understanding of the being and attributes of God. Right? Now, whenever people say all his thought was connected, they always point to some canonical texts which come up again and again and again. which show absolutely that Newton thought that the role of the natural philosopher was like that of a priest of nature, that the goal of natural philosophy was the understanding of God. Now that's I agree with, obviously. Who can deny that's the case? But the problem we have is when you look at these texts, we can all agree that Newton believed that his science was done in the service of understanding God. But what do you do with 4 million words on the whore of Babylon, on the woman in the wilderness, and so on and so forth? I would say that you cannot crush these. You can't, as Newton would say, you can't strain these, the interpretation of these, in such a way that his research, the epistemology, the way in which he tries to demonstrate truths, you can't make the way in which he tries to demonstrate truths in the Principia Mathematica the same thing as the way in which he demonstrates the perversity of 4th century monks, of the evil of Saint Athanasius, as Newton says, no saint to us. You can't do it, and that's my conclusion, which I'll come to in a while. So, natural theology. I've already gone through that, I think. The natural theology that Newton has is one that's a very basic form of what Paley will talk about in much more detail in 1802, and it's what everybody believed. It's very, very simple. There is order in the world, there is telos in the world, structures are related to function, an eye is perfectly designed by God for us to see, and so on and so forth. It's a very static, pre-Darwinian view of the world. I mean, there hasn't been that much time. There's been 5,000 years since the start of the world. There hasn't been that much time for evolution to get going, even if you were allowed to put forward some kind of evolutionary theory in Newton's time, which of course you weren't. But Newton does have a kind of evolutionary view of the universe. It's not a static universe. Even in the Principia, and in some of the draft texts of the Principia, there's some really wonderful writing, I think, about the consequences of universal gravitation, being that all ostensibly perfectly elliptical orbits cannot be like that. These planets are being pulled in every direction at every microsecond of time. And only a God can understand that and come to terms with the infinite number of forces that are involved over a longer period of time. And Newton, I think, is extremely interesting in understanding the implications of his own theory. But perhaps more interesting, just as an example, is the role of comets. Newton thinks that, like many modern scientists, of course, and Lord Kelvin, Newton thinks that comets' tails, and indeed comets themselves, are the source of life in the universe once the universe gets going. I mean, what Newton thinks is that as time goes on, he's a bit of an Aristotelian in the sense that there's, or he develops Aristotelian themes in thinking that there's always a tendency towards corruption. There's always a tendency, as opposed to generation, there's always a tendency towards motion being lost. So something needs to come into a system, a solar system or whatever, to replenish that system. And that is found in comets' tails, according to Newton. And you can see that actually in the Principia itself, in an extraordinary section in Book 3. Comets' tails play a key role in the cosmos, according to Newton. They have a recruiting function. They recruit, they replenish, they rejuvenate worlds. And they revivify life on Earth. Newton believes in a kind of circular cosmos where water falls from the sky, and then after a long process it gets heated up and then goes up into the sky again once it's evaporated, and then it falls again. And there's a cycle of life. But it is tending to run down, and as Newton famously says in optics, in a sense, this is a proof of the existence of God, because we don't see it running down. We don't experimentally understand it to be running down. But because we know intellectually it's running down, there must be something that's stopping it running down, and that must be God working through secondary causes. Very interestingly, and I think people haven't really picked up on this, dotted around, spattered in Newton's writings, is the clearly expressed view, which is quite common amongst contemporaries for various reasons, that there is life on other planets. Now, there are various reasons for thinking this in the early modern period, but effectively Newton thinks by analogy, and he argues very strongly, in fact we know he believes this very strongly, that there must be life on other planets. And he believes that all other fixed stars, so all other stars that you can see in the cosmos, are solar systems. And there is life on all of those. So he's what they call a pluralist. There are many, many, many parts of the universe that are teeming with life. He doesn't say that they are human, because that is heresy, and people are very careful in this period, if they are pluralists, not to say that life on other planets is human-like. You know, Jesus did not die for them. It doesn't say that in the Bible. He says that the sun is a star. In 1694, he suggests that he also suggests that the planets, the satellites that surround Jupiter, are proto-Earths that are being held in reserve for when this world comes to an end. How is this world going to come to an end? There's this extraordinary conversation with John Conduit in 1725, and it really is a very rich conversation, where he says that he talks about how comets come into being by particles that are given off by the sun, coalescing until they become planets. And then those planets become comets, which revolve in great orbits around a central sun. After time, gravity pulls these comets into the various stars, in our case the sun, and these stars, these suns, expand dramatically, obliterating the first 3 or 4 planets in a solar system. That's why, by the way, he says that there's, Jupiter is not going to be touched by this when it happens, but the satellites of Jupiter will be plucked. One of them will be plucked up by God and put into the position where the Earth was, and as we'll see, a new creation will come again. What's fascinating about this is that Newton thinks he has empirical proof that this will happen, because Newton lived just after the last 2 great supernovas that are visible, the 1572 and 1604 supernovas. And what he says is that these are the remnants of exactly this happening in other star systems. So that those extraordinary events which transformed astronomy, because astronomy was no longer perfect, the heavens were no longer perfect, these are, Newton says, the results of comets crashing into these star systems. And presumably these worlds will be replenished again by God. He told Conduit that there were probably beings of superior intelligence, we might say angels, who directed the motions in the cosmos. And then that this is heretical. He says that the earth had been repeopled before by God many, many times, and that this world would come to an end, and that it would be repeopled by new people. Right? Now that's extraordinarily heretical. You cannot say that in the early modern period. You can be a pluralist about worlds, but you can't deny that the people who live on this earth now are a uniquely significant creation by God. But the repeopling thing, idea that Newton has, it doesn't just imply that, it states exactly that. And what he argues, again, having looked at the great comet of 1680 through his telescope, he jokes with Conduit. This is one of the 2 or 3 times when we know Newton laughed. It's about the end of the world. One of the very few occasions when Newton chuckled was the idea that the great comet of 1680 would be the messenger of doom for humanity. My favourite example of natural theology is again a one that's unique to Newton. And it does derive in some sense from some Judeo-Christian traditions. But Newton is the first person to suggest that we could understand how God created the world by experimenting on ourselves. But what Newton says, and if you look at the General Scholium, he says this explicitly. He explicitly says it twice in the queries to the optics. What he says is that what's unique about human beings is that we have free will. He doesn't mean that we can make choices. He means that we can move our own bodies, and that there's a causal relationship between them. What Newton thinks is that if we can understand how we move our own bodies, we can understand how God created the world, and we can understand how God is related to his creation. Right from a very early time in the early 1660s, when he's coming towards the end of being an undergraduate, he does experiments on his eyes. And I've failed to put up pictures, but they're quite well known now. In some of his notebooks, you can see him drawing a picture of him putting his finger between his eye socket and his eyeball, right to the back of his eye. And then he repeats the experiment a number of times on both eyes, where he gets a brass plate, or on another occasion a bodkin, which is a sewing implement or a toothpick. And he levers up the side and the bottom of his eyeball, and he says some very pretty pictures can be made thereby. And he also he tells John Locke in 1691 that as part of this program he stared at the sun for about 30 seconds, and it made his eyes so bright they watered. And we know that he had to stay in bed for between 2 and 3 weeks with the curtains drawn, and they damaged his retina. But this program of understanding free will, the eye experiment, to make it clear, he wants to know how much of what we see is due to our free will, to ourselves, and how much is due to the way the world is outside and independent of us. These experiments go through his entire life. So even some of the last things we know he was doing was he was thinking about this issue. Since we're made in the image of God, how does an examination of the self relate to God's being? In the 28th query of his final edition of Optics, he argued that the universe had a similar relationship to God as the sensorium, that's the part of the brain where sensing occurs, had to humans. So God perceived and understood things in the universe by their immediate presence to himself. God has no need of organs, but we have need of organs to sense. But God experiences and perceives things immediately. Famously, a number of people, including Gottfried Leibniz, were critical of this idea, which lies at the heart of Newton's thinking. And in the 31st query, Newton cautioned that this did not mean that the world was the body of God, which is a heresy, and he stressed that God had no need of organs. In the same query, he noted that God is more able by his will to move the bodies within his boundless uniform sensorium, and thereby to form and reform the parts of the universe, than we are by our will to move our own bodies. So the analogy is not tight, but it gives you an insight, an inlet into God's relationship to his creation. And there are a number of extraordinary experiments that Newton does, some of them in conjunction with Robert Boyle in the mid-1670s, where he's trying to find out how it is that a thought happens in the head that causes muscles to act in accordance with what the will wants. And there's an extraordinary experiment I keep saying extraordinary, but it is, where Robert Boyle gets a tadpole and he compresses it in his air pump. And they didn't know much about ethics in this period. But they compress the tadpole and various bubbles come out of the tadpole. And Newton thinks this is the purest ether. So it's not gross air that you see outside it. It's this mysteriously fine substance by which thought processes are transmitted to the muscles. And he thinks that a program of tadpole squashing can actually tell us quite a lot about how God created the world, amazingly enough. Right, so I've talked about his other theology. In terms of words on pure prophecy, Newton wrote several million words. Partly depends on what you mean by prophecy as to how many words there are. But he takes it very, very seriously, because the great finding of the Jerusalem manuscripts in the 1970s and 80s was to knock on the head the Enlightenment view that Newton did his theological researches in his dotage. The really impassioned, and it has to be said, deeply anti-Catholic, deeply anti-Trinitarian stuff that we know, he writes, definitely comes from the 1670s and 80s. That they're amongst some of the very few texts we can date with certainty, because many of them are in the hand of his amanuensis, Humphrey Newton, brackets no relation, who was his amanuensis for the composition of the Principia in the mid to late 1680s. While he's writing the Principia, we now know, possibly just after, when a Roman Catholic king is king, about to be ejected in favour of William III. In this period, Newton writes at least one giant treatise, 250,000 words, trying to prove that there had been a great apostasy which had started in the 4th century. Like many things, the structure of Newton's interpretation is like his contemporaries. So his radical Protestant millenarian contemporaries share similar views to Newton in terms of structuring prophecy, understanding how the seals and the vials and the trumpets and the woe trumpets and the whore of Babylon and the two witnesses and the woman in the wilderness and so on and so forth, how are all these related? They all refer to periods of time. How are they, as they would say, synchronal? Newton takes this structure from his contemporaries and he proves something entirely different. And what he proves is that what most Anglicans believe, and certainly what all Catholics believe, is the religion of the devil. That's what he believes in private. And he does this at exactly the same time as he writes, arguably the greatest scientific treatise that the world has seen. What does he do? He analyses in detail the character of various miscreants in the 4th and 5th century after Christ, Jerome, Athanasius, St. Anthony, and all these people he thinks are, literally, he thinks the devil comes down to earth and manages these people. They do a deal with the devil. That's what the founder of reason believes. That's what the author of the Principia Mathematica believes. He analyses Solomon's temple because he wants to know what the true length of a cubit is. He expends a vast amount of time on the events before Christ, trying to find out what the true original Hebraic religion was, and he argues that it was a religion that was rational. It was based on the heliocentric sun-centered system. So Stonehenge, for example, was part of the so-called Vestal religion, a Pythagorean religion where people worshipped a fire in the centre of it. And he thought that if you went there, you'd see remains of a fire. And people, the concentric nature of the henges around Stonehenge bespeaks the orbits of the planets around the sun. And on at least one occasion he gave a sermon on his favourite topic, which is idolatry, because of course as an anti-Trinitarian he thinks that believing in the Holy Trinity is a form of idolatrous polytheism. Conclusion. can his work be seen as a whole? Does it have an integrity? Is it coherent? What's coherent is, I think, Newton's role. He's a Cambridge Don, and in a sense, he does what other Dons do. So all his Cambridge Platonist contemporaries, these people are effectively theologians. They're training people to be divines. That Cambridge is, unlike now, it was for breeding up divines in the Church of England. He spends most of his time on theology. That's what he does. We now know that. It is true, as Newton said, that he tossed off his mathematical discoveries and his optical discoveries and his Principia Mathematica in his spare time. Right? I sometimes say before breakfast, but we don't know that. Newton's oeuvre is not coherent. His denunciation, his analysis of Athanasius, and by the way, those people who want to look at the recent book on Newton nailing William Challoner, Challoner had no chance against Newton, because Newton is not a scientist, as Thomas Levinson says. Newton had trained himself for decades to prosecute and find guilty people who had a much greater historical standing than William Challoner. Challoner, when he accused Newton of doing naughty things in the Mint, he was signing his death warrant. He had no chance against Newton. It's not good enough to say he's searching for truth in all his endeavours. That seems trivially true, doesn't get us anywhere. And Newton himself, actually, in his apocalyptic writings, says you cannot prove scriptural truths with mathematical certainty. Jews and Muslims can do great mathematics, he says, but they will never understand the truths about Christ. Right? Finally, this is my line, really, because I really do, I'm energised by what Newton says about the heavens. As an antidote to the recent concentration on the historical sources of evolution, much more attention should be paid to the period in which Newton worked, where the exact sciences were the model for understanding God. Newton's example shows there can be no simplistic general stories about the relationship between science and religion, either at the individual or at the general level. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, questions? Yes, please.
In whose hands were Newton's theological papers before the Sotheby's auction in the 30s, and why hadn't they been published?
John Conduit, who I mentioned, married Hannah Barton, who's Newton's half-niece. They had a daughter called Kitty, who married the person who became the first Earl of Portsmouth, and they're in the Portsmouth family, along with the other papers until the Duke of Devonshire's commission of 1872, which the Duke of Devonshire basically told the fifth Earl of Portsmouth that it would be a good thing if he devoted the scientific papers to the nation, and that's why they're at Cambridge University Library. So that they're in the ownership of the Portsmouth family, and of course, I say of course, there are Henry Fellows sees them in the 1830s. Lewis Trenchard Moore sees them in the 1920s, and they're actually taken in a van with no protection to the British Library in the 1920s, so that Moore can look at them for his biography of Newton. And apart from that, hardly anyone looks at them, because everyone assumes that they are nonsense. There's a great piece of writing in the catalogue of the Portsmouth papers of 1888, because it took them 16 years to catalogue the papers, where, and I don't disagree with this assessment, but one of the people who is talking about, they're trying to come to terms with the bulk of Newton's theological papers, and they said Newton kept on writing these extraordinary apocalyptic things again and again and again. And he writes out tens of thousands of words again and again and again. There's no change between them. And he said that Newton was captured by the snare of his beautiful hand. It's as if the only reason he did this was because he had a very nice handwriting. The Victorians cannot come to terms with all this stuff. It doesn't fit into the Enlightenment or the Victorian or the early 20th century mentality.
Yes, please.
Was he a Unitarian?
Yes.
Can I just do a follow-up on the manuscripts?
Yeah.
Sorry, it was a...
No, yes, I mean, there's no sense that there's so many writings that are that attack the Trinity in so many different ways. And unless you want to go into more fine-grained distinctions between Socinianism and Arianism, which I think are quite unhelpful, because I think he's eclectic in most of the things he does. He's an independent Protestant thinker, and that's how he prides himself. So unless you go into those isms, which I think are unhelpful, then it's just as useful to say he is a Unitarian, definitely. He's a Unitarian definitely in the sense he believes in the simplicity of Christian truth, which not all Arians and Socinians do.
Just a quick follow-up on the manuscripts. Do we have any idea how many manuscripts have yet to be found? Or, I mean, just by earlier descriptions of them, and then they've never shown up. Do we know?
I mean, I think there are no new manuscripts to be found, because we have two catalogues of Newton's papers, one from 1727 and one from the early 1770s, and we know that what we have today has undergone a kind of chain of transmission, a pristine chain of transmission from that time to this time. The only exception is in the 1940s and 50s, some of the dealers who had Newton's papers chucked away some of the papers, and for reasons because some of them got wet, and I won't name the guilty, but the letters of the dealers to people like Keynes and others say, you will find that this lot is not as large as is expressed in the catalogue of the 1936 sale. That's because some of these were wet, and unfortunately we had to throw them out. So the ones that are missing are, the only stuff that's missing is it was done in the 1940s and 50s.
Yes, please.
Did he have a Christian burial, and if so, was his eulogy recorded?
Yeah, he's buried at Westminster Abbey a week after he dies, and whether I can't remember, because we have all these materials on the site. I'm not sure that there are a number of eulogies. So that obviously there's the famous Fontenelle Eloge, which was translated back into English by 5 different translators. There were 5 different editions within a week, and it's strange. I think that the Fontenelle Eloge is the major elogium that we have. I don't think that we have the exact text of what was delivered at Westminster Abbey.
Yes, please. Yes.
Could I just ask about his time at the Mint?
Yep.
Was he not involved with money, creation of money? Are there any connections between his sort of economic work and his scientific or theological thinking? I don't know if there's any sort of reflections that you have on that.
I don't think there are any connections between his alchemy and his theology. I don't think there are any connections between the theology and the Mint work. It's clear that all the decades he spent in alchemy were useful for him when it came to things like the trial of the Picts. So the kind of periodic inspection of various proof pieces to see whether the gold-silver ratio was as the people to whom the work was contracted said it was. And Newton was used to dealing with parts that were much finer than those used by the best goldsmiths. So he definitely used his skills in that regard. Other than that, it's hard to make a connection.
Okay, please.
Yes, you mentioned the anthropic principle right at the start of your talk.
Yeah.
I wondered how much of the incredible tolerances that we now know about from the Big Bang onwards, in order for carbon-based life form to appear on Earth here, how much of that would he have known? And if so, what significance would he have put onto that?
I think he gestures towards it. He knows nothing about the parts of the air. You know, there's the contemporary views about the air is simply that air is different in Paris from what it is in London. There's a goodness of air, so air is better or worse, but they know nothing about they know nothing really about the component parts of air. People have tried to extract what they think is niter. So Robert Boyle has tried to extract niter from air with a small amount of success, but those kind of sophisticated views just don't, they're not there. Sorry.
Thank you. At the back, please, yes.
What theological writers does he engage with principally in his theological works, among his contemporaries and predecessors?
Yeah, his main source is Joseph Mead. He's the only person for whom Newton has any respect. There's hardly anybody named in his writings, and one of my great discoveries was that in a footnote that Newton had obliterated on the page, he'd scrubbed out a reference to Ralph Cubworth's True Intellectual System of 1678, and he reads voraciously. I think he reads compendia, so I think he reads cheats. He reads modern translations, and then if something takes his fancy, he goes to the original, which he has either in the public library, which is now the university library, or else in Trinity College library, and of course he has his own library. But the presentation of self as a radical Protestant individualist is always that he communes with the texts directly. Put another way, he's very poor at giving credit to anyone else. And you can see that. The great example is the Leibniz-Newton dispute over the calculus, because Newton attended Barrow's inaugural lectures in March 1664 as Lucasian professor, and he never mentions this until in 1712, 1713, in manuscripts. He needs to show that Leibniz could have got some techniques related to tangents from somebody else. And then he says, I know that Mr. Barrow was talking about these techniques because I attended these lectures. And so he never gives credit to Barrow, and it's obvious that he gets a lot from Barrow. But only as a last-ditch effort does he admit this.
Please, yes.
I was interested in what you said about his plea for tolerance. If I remember, Locke had about 43 Socinian volumes on his shelf.
Yeah.
Newton had 8, but of course he visited Locke and they spoke, so he must have bought it a lot. And yet he himself believed in the pre-existence of Christ, but he was very tolerant of Socinians who didn't. And he clearly was of that stamp, like Milton, Cromwell, Locke himself, who were quite far-seeing and who really did plead for tolerance. Yes. And I wondered whether his down against Athanasius was because we know now from Bell's published letters and stuff in the Egyptian monasteries that Athanasius was a Trinitarian bully boy.
Yep.
And as many of them were. Yeah? I think he had a good historical insight, and which I think must have fed his plea for tolerance. Unlike, because what happened to poor Whiston after that? Yeah. And of course, that's why I think one historian has described Newton as the Nicodemus, the guy who came by night, couldn't come openly, as it were, and kept a lot of his anti-Trinitarianism secret in his public life.
Well, sure. I mean, it's a problem for Calvinists. Nicodemism is a problem for Calvinists because they spend most of their time attacking Catholics for being insincere and dishonest. So Nicodemism is a very important tactic for Newton. I mean, after all, in his prophetic writings, he said, I'm writing this because I have a duty to tell the world about all the truths that I've found. But he's writing in a period where his beliefs are utterly unpalatable to society. There is capital punishment on the statute books, but I think that he would fear social ostracism more than capital punishment. I think that the big transition of Newton is from a radical Puritan of the 1640s, which he is in the 1670s and 80s, at a time when the Protestant state is under threat. I think that he becomes he certainly remains an angry old man in his older age, but he actually starts writing pieces towards the end of his life where he even imagines that because being a good neighbour, because charity is more important than faith, that you could have a polity where you have Catholics. And as long as you lived as good neighbours, then what you believe privately doesn't matter. Now, obviously, within Protestantism, that view is promoted 20, 30 years earlier by Locke and his friends. But, of course, to actually bring Catholics into the polity, I mean, that's something that happens in Philadelphia, but not in any other places. So Newton goes soft on Catholics. He still thinks that it's the religion of the beast, but he thinks they could be good next-door neighbours. You know.
I think we better start. I mean, it's a fascinating area. We could certainly go on for a long time, but I think we better stop there. We promise we do finish the seminars at 2 o'clock. So we just want to really thank Robert for a really fascinating talk.